The clock struck 11:47 a.m., exactly 17 minutes into the interrogation, marking the precise instant when Ilhan Omar realized a monumental error had been committed. Directly across from her, FBI Director Kash Patel remained seated with his hands resting calmly upon a crimson folder. His countenance was remarkably tranquil, almost ethereal, resembling a strategist who had just revealed an unbeatable hand and was merely waiting for his opponents to grasp the inevitability of their defeat. Omar was positioned forward in her chair, a mobile device held tightly to her ear, while her legal counsel whispered frantic instructions into her periphery. The House Oversight Committee chamber had descended into an absolute, heavy stillness, not the respectful quietude typically afforded to congressional proceedings, but rather a paralyzed, breathless silence born of collective astonishment. An estimated 47 million spectators were observing the event live across various broadcasting networks as C-SPAN's infrastructure struggled under the unprecedented digital traffic and social media platforms experienced multiple technical failures. Yet, within that suspended fragment of time, those systemic collapses paled in comparison to the realization etched upon Ilhan Omar's face. This trajectory was entirely unanticipated, as she was intended to occupy the role of the relentless interrogator prepared to scrutinize Kash Patel before a national audience regarding allegations of politically motivated investigations against progressive lawmakers. Instead, the roles had been dramatically inverted, leaving her unable to provide coherent responses to the inquiries directed at her. To fully comprehend the sequence of events leading to this mid-career crisis, one must observe the proceedings from the beginning, a mere 17 minutes prior. Chairman Mike Johnson struck the gavel 3 times, the resonance of the wood echoing through the sophisticated architectural details of the chamber, as he declared the House Oversight Committee hearing officially in session. He stated that the day's objective was to investigate concerns regarding the operational protocols of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and claims of partisan investigations targeting incumbent members of Congress. His gaze shifted toward Kash Patel, who sat isolated at the witness stand without the typical retinue of handlers or public relations experts, possessing only a leather portfolio and a glass of water. The chairman expressed his gratitude for the director's voluntary appearance, to which Patel adjusted his microphone and offered a professional, steady acknowledgement of his readiness to assist the committee. His voice carried the resonance of an experienced official who had navigated countless such hearings and possessed an intimate understanding of their procedural nuances. Ilhan Omar then leaned toward her microphone, attired in a striking purple hijab and a precisely tailored black ensemble, her gaze radiating a sharp, unwavering confidence. This was the moment for which she had spent weeks meticulously preparing. Director Patel, her voice pierced the atmosphere with the precision of a blade, as she asserted that the American citizenry was entitled to transparent and direct communication. She paused momentarily, allowing the broadcast cameras to capture her expression before continuing to detail how, over the preceding 6 months, numerous progressive legislators had reported being surveilled and subjected to what she characterized as federal harassment. She mentioned that the committee had been presented with multiple credible whistleblower accounts suggesting the FBI was conducting active surveillance on no fewer than 12 sitting members of the House. The chamber buzzed with whispered energy as journalists prepared to capture what they believed would be the day's most significant headline. Omar's tone intensified as she argued that these targets were not chosen at random, but were specifically progressive, Muslim individuals of color who dared to challenge established foreign policy and demand institutional accountability. She maintained intense eye contact with Patel, posing a binary question. Was the FBI currently investigating any sitting member of the United States Congress? Without a moment of hesitation or a shift in his gaze, Kash Patel responded in the affirmative. The room immediately erupted into a cacophony of audible shock and the rapid mechanical clicking of camera shutters. A legislator in the back was heard uttering a surprised expletive, which was inadvertently captured by the high-sensitivity microphones. A slight, triumphant smile appeared on Omar's lips, believing she had secured a public admission that would validate her claims of political persecution. She followed up by asking how many of these investigations were specifically directed at Muslim or progressive members. Patel calmly clarified that while some subjects identified with those descriptions, the context of the law was paramount. Omar abruptly intervened, dismissing his request for elaboration and demanding a direct answer regarding whether he had personally authorized surveillance on any member of the current committee. In the gallery behind her, her attorney was visible, frantically signaling for her to cease this line of questioning, recognizing the legal trap she was inadvertently setting for herself. However, fueled by her perceived initial success, Omar failed to notice the warning, walking directly into her own metaphorical cross-examination. Patel took a measured breath, explaining that while he does not personally initiate individual surveillance, he does review and approve investigative recommendations from field offices that meet the rigorous probable cause standards dictated by federal statutes. He concluded that if a committee member was under investigation, it was the result of career FBI professionals, not political appointees, identifying evidence of potential federal crimes significant enough to warrant legal action. Omar's reaction was one of open derision, scoffing at the phrase potential federal crimes, and challenging the director to specify exactly what offenses he was accusing sitting representatives of committing. The room fell into a deep, expectant silence. Patel looked at her for an extended period before speaking in a tone that was measured and almost sorrowful, asking if she truly wished for him to disclose such details in a public, televised session. This was her final opportunity to retreat, but her pride and the pressure of the national spotlight compelled her to press forward. She demanded that he provide a direct answer, asserting that she would not display weakness. Patel nodded slowly, as if fulfilling a duty he had hoped to avoid, and signaled to an assistant to distribute sealed folders, stamped as cleared for public release to every member of the committee. The atmosphere shifted into a state of controlled chaos as representatives scanned the documents, with reactions ranging from stunned disbelief to frantic reading. Omar's own hands exhibited a slight tremor as she opened her folder, a detail captured by the high-definition cameras. Patel waited with a neutral expression, eventually explaining that the documents contained redacted summaries of 3 active FBI investigations involving campaign finance irregularities, wire fraud, and potential violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, concerning current House members. When Omar protested the irregularity of distributing active files, Patel reminded her that she had demanded total transparency regarding these investigations and that he was merely fulfilling her request. He even offered to move to a sensitive compartmented information facility, SCIF, if she preferred privacy. But she doubled down, stating she had nothing to hide, despite her evaporating confidence. Patel then focused on case file 2021 DC 4478, involving $2.7 million in campaign funds paid to a firm owned by an individual with whom the candidate reportedly shared an undisclosed personal relationship. He detailed how the investigation stemmed from a formal complaint alleging that these funds were diverted for personal use, which would constitute a violation of Federal Election Commission regulations and potentially federal wire fraud. As the technical details of the financial discrepancies were laid out, Omar's composure began to visibly deteriorate. When a fellow committee member asked for clarification on the identity of the subject, Patel stated he could not confirm names but noted the file concerned a representative from Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. The realization that she was the primary subject of the disclosure became undeniable. The director proceeded to present a chronological timeline, demonstrating how payments to the firm in question escalated significantly in tandem with reports of a personal relationship between the representative and the firm's owner. He highlighted a specific month where $250,000 was paid to the firm, contrasting it with the much lower expenditures of comparable congressional campaigns. Forensic accounting, he revealed, traced a significant portion of those funds not to campaign services but to personal expenses, including a luxury international vacation and a down payment on a residential property owned jointly by the representative and the consultant. Omar's attempts to characterize these as legitimate expenses were met with cold, documented facts. The inquiry then shifted to her historical tax filings and marriage records, where Patel presented evidence suggesting she had filed joint federal returns with one individual while legally married to another, a discrepancy that carries severe federal penalties for perjury and making false statements. He further touched upon immigration concerns related to her previous marriage, supported by witness statements suggesting the union was primarily intended to secure legal residency status. Finally, Patel addressed a sensitive folder regarding meetings with foreign officials in Istanbul and subsequent financial contributions to her campaign from entities with ties to those foreign interests. He questioned her lack of registration under FARA, culminating in the disclosure of intercepted messages discussing compensation for legislative advocacy. This led to the defining moment at 11:47 a.m., where, upon the advice of her counsel, Ilhan Omar invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The subsequent political and legal fallout was swift and absolute. The narrative concluded with the observation that transparency is a double-edged sword. While Omar had sought to use it as a weapon against the FBI, she ultimately found herself exposed by the very clarity she had demanded. The hearing did not just damage a reputation, it effectively concluded a political career, serving as a stark reminder that the law, when supported by immutable documentation, applies equally to all, regardless of their station. Would you like me to analyze the specific rhetorical strategies used in this text? Or perhaps help you draft a script for a video based on this narrative? Section 6. The 48-hour media fallout and the behind-the-scenes panic. The immediate 48 hours following the 11:47 a.m. collapse were characterized by a level of political volatility unseen in the modern era. While the public watched the clips on loop, a much more desperate drama was unfolding within the upper echelons of the Democratic National Committee, DNC. The initial strategy to frame Director Patel's testimony as a partisan hit job had been rendered obsolete by the sheer volume of physical evidence. You cannot narrative your way out of a townhouse down payment receipt. Inside the West Wing and at DNC headquarters, the mood was one of cold pragmatism. Internal polling, conducted in near real time, showed a devastating swing. It wasn't just that Republican voters were energized. It was that independent and moderate Democratic voters were expressing a sense of deep betrayal. The transparency that Omar had championed had become a mirror, reflecting a reality that her supporters could no longer ignore. By 0 p.m. On the day of the hearing, the defense talking points had been replaced by containment strategies. Senior advisors to the Speaker of the House were reportedly locked in a war room session that lasted until the early hours of the morning. The question was no longer how to save Omar's seat, but how to prevent her fall from dragging down the entire party's prospects in the upcoming midterm elections. The squad, once seen as the invincible vanguard of the New Left, was suddenly being viewed as a liability. The silence from her colleagues wasn't just a lack of support. It was a tactical retreat. Section 7. The primary challenger and the local rejection. While the national media focused on the theater of the hearing, the real death knell for Omar's career was ringing in Minneapolis. Within 3 days, a prominent local figure, a moderate Democrat with deep roots in the city's business and activist communities, announced her candidacy for the 5th District. Her campaign launch was a masterclass in political timing. She didn't attack Omar's ideology. She attacked her effectiveness. We need a representative who spends their time in the district, not in a federal courtroom, she told a packed town hall. The shift in local sentiment was jarring. Community leaders who had once stood as a human shield around Omar were now unavailable for comment. The local newspapers, which had previously offered nuanced defenses of her controversies, began publishing investigative pieces into how the local branch of the party had failed to vet her finances years earlier. The grassroots support that had propelled her to national stardom was evaporating, replaced by a sense of exhaustion. Section 8. The legal machinery grinds forward. Behind the political circus, the Department of Justice was moving with a terrifying, quiet efficiency. The red folders Patel had produced were only the tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit was processing thousands of pages of subpoenaed bank records from the E Street Group. It became clear that the $2.7 million was only one part of a larger, more complex system of self-enrichment. Sources within the DOJ leaked that several low-level staffers from the Omar campaign had already entered into proffers preliminary agreements to share information in exchange for leniency. The human shield of lawyers and PR experts that had surrounded the Congresswoman for years was beginning to fray as the reality of 51 federal counts set in. Wire fraud, in particular, is a paper trail crime. It doesn't rely on witness testimony as much as it relies on the immutable logic of digital ledgers. Section 9. The legacy of the 1147 moment. Months later, as the trial date approached and the primary election loomed, the political world began to reflect on what the 1147 moment actually signified. It wasn't just the fall of a single politician. It was the end of an era of perceived untouchability for the new political celebrity class. The idea that a massive social media following and a righteous narrative could serve as a permanent shield against federal oversight had been dismantled in 17 minutes. Director Kash Patel, who remained a figure of intense scrutiny and admiration alike, became the personification of the institutionalist. He didn't use rhetoric. He used records. He didn't use emotion. He used evidence. In the end, the story of Ilhan Omar's career wasn't a tragedy of political persecution, but a cautionary tale of the arrogance of power. She had invited the dragon into the room, certain that her fire was hotter. She was wrong. Section 10. The final stand and the closing of the campaign. By the 7th week, the once vibrant campaign headquarters of Minnesota's 5th District had been reduced to a skeletal operation. The atmosphere was no longer defined by the high-energy idealism of a grassroots movement, but by the hollow, echoing silence of an organization in its final hours. The squad branding that had adorned the walls was beginning to peel, a physical manifestation of the political decay that had accelerated since the 11:47 a.m. collapse. Security was tight, but the crowds of supporters had been replaced by a phalanx of process servers and investigative journalists. In the final days before the primary, Ilhan Omar made one last attempt to reclaim the narrative. She stood on a makeshift stage in a community center, the lighting dim and the audience sparse. Her speech was a return to her roots, an appeal to the marginalized, and a condemnation of the militarized federal apparatus she claimed was hunting her. However, the rhetoric, which had once sparked national headlines, now felt like a transmission from a distant, fading frequency. The local community, grappling with the tangible fallout of the Feeding Our Future scandal and the recent surges in federal enforcement, was no longer looking for a revolutionary. They were looking for a representative who could provide stability. The primary night was not a cliffhanger. By 9 p.m., the results were undeniable. The challenger had secured a 24-point lead, carrying districts that had been the bedrock of Omar's support for years. There was no concession speech on national television, no defiant walk to the podium. Instead, a brief, written statement was released to the press as a black SUV pulled away from the rear of the building, disappearing into the cold Minneapolis night. The political era of the insurgent had hit a wall of forensic reality. Section 11. The courtroom architecture of a federal trial. 3 months later, the focus shifted from the ballot box to the heavy oak doors of the United States District Court. The arraignment was a study in institutional gravity. Unlike the House Oversight Committee, there were no microphones for grandstanding and no cameras to capture the theater of the moment. There was only the judge, the prosecution, and the defendant. Director Kash Patel was not present for the opening statements, but his presence was felt in every exhibit entered into the record. The prosecution's case was built with the same brick-by-brick precision that Patel had demonstrated months earlier. They began by laying out the digital ledger of the E Street Group, correlating every consulting fee with a specific personal expenditure. The jury was shown bank statements, mortgage documents, and those now infamous Instagram posts from the Maldives, which were no longer just social media artifacts, but Government Exhibit A. The defense attempted to frame the case as a complex misunderstanding of cultural financial practices and campaign logistics. They argued that the high fees were a reflection of the unique security and digital needs of a high-profile Muslim woman in the modern political climate. However, the prosecution countered with a devastating piece of evidence: the testimony of the campaign's former treasurer, who had accepted an immunity deal. He described, in dry, technical detail, how he had been instructed to mask the personal payments as travel and fundraising expenses. Section 12. The forensic finale. As the trial entered its third week, the most damaging evidence was revealed: the full, unredacted WhatsApp communications with the foreign intermediaries. The jury listened to audio recordings and read transcripts of messages that discussed the timing of legislative votes in exchange for support packages. The defense's narrative of a witch hunt was systematically dismantled by the defendant's own words. The closing arguments were a somber affair. The prosecution didn't need to shout. They simply pointed to the mountain of documents. The law, they argued, does not care about your identity or your ideology. It only cares about the truth of the transaction. When the jury finally retreated to deliberate, the consensus in the gallery was that the verdict was a formality. The 1147 moment hadn't just been a political disaster. It had been the beginning of a legal inevitability.